We had an experience yesterday in the state coordinators meeting where we went around the room to every state that's here and gave everybody 5 to 7 minutes to give an update of what's going on for quail conservation in your state. And it was eye-opening to hear that array of stories. There's a lot of bright spots, encouraging things happening, more states either doing official NBCI focal areas or in the process of setting them up or wanting to. Other states doing lots of other bobwhite conservation activities. But across the board, every single state that stood up would always have a but. We don't have enough money to do the monitoring. We don't have enough money to do all the management. We'd like to do another focal area, but we just don't have enough money or staff. It's just time after time after time. We don't have enough money to do what we want to do and what we know needs to be done. So after a while, it got almost depressing. And we considered starting happy hour at 3 o'clock yesterday, but our agenda kept us there till 6. But it was a perfect segue to what I want to spend a few minutes on now, asking the question, is it time for the next big step for bobwhite and upland game bird conservation? Y'all have seen this graph many times. This is every single state in its historic range, bobwhites are declining. Even in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, where they still, in Nebraska, where populations are still very darn good, relatively speaking, they're still going down long term. And if you look across the country, for just about every species of resident upland game birds in the United States, they're in long-term declines. It's a pretty dismal situation, and the more you think about it, the direr the whole situation seems. And that situation, as good as all of us are trying to be about this and stepping up, we are saddled with a fundamental disconnect in the way wildlife conservation is handled in the United States, where we are in a situation where federal government has jurisdiction over part of our wildlife and states have jurisdiction over another part. And that disconnect creates challenges for us trying to deal with resident game birds that are state species. We have a culture that we all live with and is part of our profession where those two pieces are not supposed to meet or cross. And that's the way it is, and I get that, whether I like it or not, I get that. And so the feds go about doing their thing with migratory birds, the states go about doing their thing with this approach that never the two shall meet. Unfortunately, the two are meeting, because when those declines continue long enough, despite this principle of never the two shall meet, when you pass a certain line, the feds get state birds. And then the principle that we've all stood on for a while starts getting diluted, and life gets more complicated, and it's really not a good situation for anybody. So we don't want bobwhites to go there, and we really don't want any other birds to go there. So the positive side of this is the states are starting to get ahead of the curve on numerous upland game bird species. And so the states over the last decade have created several pretty thoughtful long-term strategic plans for various resident game bird species or groups of species. And of course with our own NBCI added to that. The problem is not one single one of those plans has come with any new money for implementation. They're good plans, thoughtful plans put together by very intelligent, driven people, but not a dollar of new money comes with them. This is McKenzie's view of the world. That status quo, combining all those declining species long term and no new money to address increasingly dire problems, is overall an unacceptable situation. And I contend that our group should not and cannot sit while this situation continues. So I'm here to try to help this group start a conversation to do something about an unacceptable situation. So what do you do about an unacceptable situation, especially one this big? Well, I tried to break this down into steps in the way my mind works, one piece at a time. How do you get from A to B in addressing something like this? Somebody's got to start a conversation. And then if you can get a conversation started, then somebody has to pick up that conversation and that idea and move forward with it and shepherd that idea and try to mold it and grow it and nurture it. And then eventually something has to be proposed, something tangible and defined has to be put on the table and in writing that everybody can look at and debate and argue about, but you've got to put something specific on the table at some point. And then we, all of us, all of our states, all of our organizations, not just in Bobwhite range but across the country, eventually have to start uniting around something. We've got to start coming together, overcoming arguments about details, and uniting for something that will make our situation better than it is now. And once we get to that point, we're still not going to solve this problem immediately. It's going to take a long time. Just like center pivot corners in CP33 took 19 years, hopefully a solution to this resident game bird problem won't take 19 years, but it will take years, even after we've gone through steps 1 through 4. So we have to persevere over time with whatever that thing is that we've united around. So going through those 5 steps here real quick, someone has started the discussion on this by proposing a national upland game bird stamp as a discussion starter idea, and just that. An outdoor writer in Oklahoma named Chad Love wrote about this on his Field and Stream blog about 4 years ago. And then last year, or early this year, a group of sportsmen that run a website called Ultimate Upland wrote an article starting to advocate for a national upland game bird stamp. They created a bit of a furor with that notion. But those Ultimate Upland folks, to their credit, I called them because I saw their article and was kind of interested because they seemed pretty well informed when they wrote the article. Come to find out, of their own initiative and on their own money, they were going to the North American Wildlife Conference this past March just to meet people, just to be where the business of wildlife conservation is done at the national level, and to maybe have a chance to pitch their idea somewhere and sort of get a temperature read on the reaction of the people at the conference. So I gave them tips on a couple of meetings you might want to go to, including the NBCI Management Board and the Resident Game Bird Working Group of AFWA. And those folks showed up to those meetings and made their pitches, and people listened and talked a little bit, but not a whole lot. But since March, the idea has kind of stuck around, and people are talking about it informally, not really sure what to make of it or where to go with it or what to do with it. But then came this new group created by AFWA called the Blue Ribbon Panel for Sustaining America's Fish and Wildlife Resources. And that's a group of high-rolling, high-level conservation administrators, industry leaders, politicians who all care about conservation of fish and wildlife. And they're trying to look for creative new funding ideas to increase the sustained funding for fish and wildlife conservation. Hopefully, funding from places that aren't already paying into the conservation system. And so the Blue Ribbon Panel was seeking input on ideas. And they sent me 2 separate emails. They probably sent hundreds of people emails, but I felt really special because they had my name on it, Don McKenzie. And they wanted input from the NBCI officially. And I was on vacation when they sent the first one. When I came back from vacation, I got the second one, and I had a 4-day timeline. So things moved pretty quick, but I consulted with some of the NBTC leaders and NBCI staff, and then I consulted with the executive committee of the NBCI Management Board about a letter and input from the NBCI. And I was using this idea of a National Upland Game Bird Stamp as a conversation starter. And I didn't want to let the chance to go by without saying something, so we wrote a letter to this panel. I ran it again by the executive committee of the NBCI Management Board. They gave me approval to send a letter, so I hit send. And since then, the conversation has started about this idea. The conversation has many different flavors, as you would expect, but at least the conversation has started. And I feel pretty good about the NBCI having gone officially on the record as endorsing this idea as a starting place for a discussion, in part because we're in a good position with the states funding the NBCI, 25 separate states stepping up, demonstrating their commitment and readiness to do something more for bobwhites. So I thought the NBCI is probably a good outfit to make this step and start this conversation. So now that it started, where does it go from here? And understand everything from here on out is just McKenzie's way of looking at the world and a stepwise process. But in my view, the Resident Game Bird Working Group of AFWA is the group that could and should take this idea and argue over it and deliberate over it and shape it into something palatable. That group is the one group that focuses on our birds, resident game birds, and they're an official arm of the states. They are the state's national body for dealing with resident game bird issues. So they are the one group that, above and beyond anybody else, that could take this idea and make something of it and have the credibility and the stature to be listened to. So we've now identified, we started the conversation, I've identified a group that can lead the process. So then you got to come up with something to debate and do. And so I just jotted down some options. If I was going to try to start with a clean slate and say, okay, if I was going to try to do something really big and better at the national level for resident game birds, what might it be? And the first thing that we always hear, when things get tough and stressful, is we start turning on one another and we start pointing fingers. Mike Black, you ought to be doing better, and Quail will be better. And New Jersey, y'all ought to be doing better, and Quail will be doing better. And Missouri and everybody else, if y'all are doing your jobs better, then things will be better off. And we can argue that all day. And maybe there's a little truth around the edges to that. We can all do better. But that's not the big gains that we have to have. We've got to get beyond pointing fingers at one another. And so the other options then that I could think of, one is take the greater sage grouse and lesser prairie chicken strategy. We just do what we do as long as we can until the feds take over, then it's their problem. We don't have to worry about it much anymore. I'm pretty sure nobody here would endorse that as our preferred approach to bobwhites and other resident game birds. So then your list of options starts getting pretty short. You could do state upland game bird stamps in every state, and that would help. There's no doubt that would help. But that's not a solution to all the problems and challenges. And then there's the idea of the national upland game bird stamp. Or we look to a congressional act for congressionally appropriated money. And maybe there's other ideas. There's almost undoubtedly some other kind of idea out there, but a lot of smart people have been thinking about this for a long time, and I haven't heard any ideas that are better or more viable than this list yet. So none of these are new, none of these are creative ideas, none of these go beyond, or most of these don't go beyond shaking down the people that have already been contributing into conservation all along. But that doesn't mean that some of these ideas are not viable and that their time has not come. So I want to take a minute to look quickly at the waterfowl situation. One correction to Andrew's introduction for me is I got my master's degree at the University of Missouri, not at Auburn. And I was a duck guy in Missouri, so the first part of my career was spent in waterfowl and wetland management. In the first several years, I was immersed in that world. And it was illuminating, and especially transitioning now to be a hardcore quail guy. But those lessons from the duck world still stick with me, because the duck guys know how to do things right. And they've had a 75-year head start on us, but they do things right. When they were in our situation in 1934 with continental populations tanking, they passed the duck stamp. And that has an 80-year track record or something now of proven success and proven value. And buying a federal duck stamp is the cost of doing business to duck hunters. It doesn't stop anybody from hunting. They may complain a little bit just because it's fun to complain, but it doesn't get in the way of people enjoying duck hunting. Well, duck populations tanked again in the 70s and created a panic. They tanked bad enough that they were in the same situation again that we're in right now with bobwhites. The duck guys got their act together. They had all that experience working across states, across flyways, even across international boundaries, and they drafted the North American Waterfowl Management Plan in 1986. That plan, just like the NBCI, just like the pheasant plan, just like the Western Quail Plan, was unfunded. But those guys had their act together so well. In 3 years, they passed an act of Congress to create a whole new funding mechanism, brand new money, for the overall purpose of implementing that North American Waterfowl Management Plan. So they went 3 years, plan, money, boom, boom, boom. It's amazing how they pulled that off. The other side of that picture, though, for NAWCA is that depends on congressional appropriations. A completely different funding mechanism from a stamp. And the duck guys do everything they do well. And they have done well at lobbying for appropriations for NAWCA all these years. Even through recessions, through sequestrations, through changing administrations and Congresses, they've managed to keep NAWCA appropriations at a pretty impressive level all this time. And they're doing very good work with it, and duck populations now continentally, with only a few exceptions, but overall they're doing very well these days. So when you think about all those aspects and opportunities and options, an old life lesson from Max Peterson, who used to be the president of ALPHA, comes back to my mind about not letting the perfect get in the way of the good. Because there is no perfect answer to doing something big and different for upland game bird conservation. So you give up the idea of a perfect answer. Take it off the table. So what we're looking for now is a better answer, or the best answer of the options that are on the table. So that's what we're searching for. Not perfect, just the best answer possible. And so that was the thinking behind the letter that I signed and sent to the Blue Ribbon panel with writing help from Tom Franklin and Daly, and consultation from several others. And the concepts that are in that letter and part of this idea: first, a national mandatory user fee. One of the suggestions that I got before I wrote the letter was just make it bobwhites. Don't impose on any of the other game bird species, because they may or may not like the idea. And so I chewed on that idea for a while, just a national bobwhite stamp. And the more I thought about that, the less viable that seemed. And it almost seemed silly to do a national stamp just for bobwhites. And so in my mind, I reached the conclusion, we're all in this or we're not for upland game birds across the country. So it's a national stamp or it's no stamp. So I wrote a letter proposing a national stamp for all upland game bird hunting. And the mechanism, again, there is no perfection. So the mechanism that we suggested was for the service, Fish and Wildlife Service, a federal agency, to be the money collector, but immediately turn around and disperse those revenues back to the states. So it is not a Fish and Wildlife Service program. The Fish and Wildlife Service would just be the money collector and the money disperser back to the states. So this would be state money. And the only two details that we put in the letter first were that the money be dispersed back to the states, so it's not a federal program. The other detail was that the money would have to be securely and confidently guaranteed to be dedicated for upland game bird conservation, so that it could not be diverted for any other purposes, and that it be enforced and by federal and state authorities, both. So just to provoke your imagination a little bit, these are strictly hypothetical numbers, but with very roughly 6 million resident upland game bird hunters among turkey, pheasant, quail, and grouse hunters, at $5 a piece, you're talking a $30 million pot of money. At $25 a piece, we're talking $150 million per year of money that would be new money that would be coming back to states for upland game bird conservation. I don't know what any magic number would be, and that's open for debate. The problem is going to come in the details, and there are many, many details. What species to include, how do you guarantee its use for upland game birds, how do you allocate the money among states, do you require a match by the states, how do you prioritize the species of upland game birds for conservation, and what activities for conservation might be eligible. None of those questions are known. They're just only beginning to be asked, and I was asked a lot of those yesterday when I was giving this information to the 2 meetings yesterday. There's a lot of predictable concerns and objections that people will raise, like no more taxes or fees, period, enough already. We don't like the federal government. We don't want their hands touching anything to do with resident game birds. This is federal overreach. The feds might attach strings after the fact, like no more lead shot. This is just redistribution of wealth. I mean, there's lots of objections that you could foresee. But my view of this, looking at it, is we are now where the duck guys were early in the last century, when they were in panic mode and they were afraid they might lose their resources for good and their recreation. And they stepped up. So a question for all of you and for all the resident game bird people in this country is, are duck hunters inherently better conservationists than upland game bird hunters? I don't think they are, but they sure appear to be, because they have stepped up and they're putting their money seriously into the conservation of their resources, much better than upland game bird hunters are. It also appears to me state stamps alone would be helpful, but not enough for all of the vagaries of all of the state stamps and habitat stamps that states have had, and varying experiences over that over time. To start wrapping up here is to think strategically about how something like this might even have a snowball's chance of moving forward. It has to be a state-driven process. It's got to come from all the states of their own initiative, coming together and agreeing that something's got to be done, coming up with the best thing that could be, and moving forward with the state's energy. If the states provide leadership on that and movement, and sportsmen's groups can get encouraged by the state's leaderships and come to the side of the states and say, yeah, we like this, we want it, we would support it, we're willing to pay another however many dollars a year if it's going to help our birds, then you start having a politically viable process underway, and movement and coalition. So in my view, the need is imperative. The time is right. The objections, the many objections that can be raised and the detailed questions are all valid, but I contend none of them are insurmountable. And I also believe that it is my responsibility as NBCI Director, the NBCI's responsibility as an initiative of the states, and all of our responsibility to do something. I mean, we're in a good position. We have some leadership we can offer to an issue like this. And I contend that's why we're here, and that the states expect the NBCI to provide some leadership in close coordination with the states, of course. And I also contend that the states that are supporting NBCI, thank you very much, are expecting value back from their investment in NBCI. And if we can provide leadership on an issue of this magnitude, of this importance long term, that would be very serious value back to the states if we can ever pull this off. So last point, just for the record, yesterday the NBTC steering committee deliberated this idea at length. and ended with a 9-0 vote with no abstentions in support of this motion. The NBTC Steering Committee recommends that the AFLA Resident Game Bird Working Group consider an upland game bird stamp or other suitable option for creating sustainable and dedicated new national funding for upland game bird conservation as a needed and viable concept that deserves to be pursued. So that's, the steering committee is now on record supporting the discussion of an idea some sort of like this. So I will be taking that vote and this idea to AFLA and hoping that we can continue to grow and move this discussion forward in a constructive way with the states. And maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but something has to work. So I will end here. I appreciate your time and attention, and feel free to grab me and accost me and whatever over any of these ideas and set me straight. Forward to discussing this topic with all of you. Thank you very much.